I never expected that a quiet evening would change everything. But when she looked at me and whispered, "I've wanted this longer than you could ever imagine," I realized some feelings can't be hidden forever. I didn't plan on staying late that night. It was supposed to be nothing more than a casual stop, a quick visit, a simple gathering, something to pass the hours before heading home. But somehow, the evening stretched, the conversations deepened, and the air shifted in ways I couldn't quite explain. She was there. I'd known her for a while, always at a respectful distance. She carried herself with the kind of grace that comes from experience, the kind of confidence you notice before you even hear her voice. And yet, there was something quiet in her eyes, too, something almost hidden, as though she carried stories no one had asked her to tell. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp spilling golden light across her profile. I remember how it caught the lines of her face. Not harsh lines, but gentle ones, the kind that spoke of both laughter and resilience. She sat across from me at first, her posture easy, her presence grounding. We spoke with the group for a while, but slowly, as the conversations branched off, it felt like the two of us were left in our own little corner. She asked me about my work, my plans, the little things I usually brush off with quick answers. But with her, I didn't feel the urge to hold back. There was something in the way she listened, her eyes steady, her lips curved in that soft, patient smile, that made me want to give her more. The air was warm, not stifling, but comforting, carrying the faint scent of her perfume. It wasn't overwhelming, just a delicate trace that lingered when she leaned in a little closer to hear me better. I noticed the way her hair, dark with faint streaks of silver catching the light, slipped over her shoulder when she tilted her head. I noticed far too much, perhaps, but I couldn't stop myself. Every little detail stayed with me. The way her fingers tapped lightly on the rim of her glass when she thought, the quiet laugh that escaped her when I said something unexpected. It wasn't the kind of laugh that filled the room. It was smaller, more intimate, like it belonged only to the moment we were sharing. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I felt the weight of the rest of the world drift away. It wasn't the noise around us or the hours that kept slipping by. It was her presence, steady and quietly magnetic. I didn't know where the night was leading. I only knew that something about the way she looked at me made it impossible to leave. It wasn't just attraction, it was curiosity, intrigue, something deeper tugging at the edges of my chest. And so I stayed. What began as an ordinary evening was already becoming something I couldn't ignore. It's strange how certain conversations don't just pass, they stay. They leave a trace, like a melody you can't stop humming under your breath. That's what talking to her felt like that night. At first, it was light, easy, the kind of small talk that usually dissolves without meaning. But the way she spoke, measured, thoughtful, turned even the simplest words into something worth listening to. She didn't just answer questions. She painted them with small pieces of herself, little shades of humor and vulnerability that drew me in before I even realized it was happening. I remember asking about her travels, and her eyes lit up. She spoke of quiet villages she'd wandered through, the way she collected stories in the same way other people might collect souvenirs. Her voice softened as she described a sunset she once watched alone by the sea. She said it as though it had stayed with her all these years, as though it meant more than just light fading over water. I found myself leaning closer, not just to hear her better, but because the pull between us had started to feel undeniable. And then, almost without thinking, I shared something with her that I hadn't told anyone else in months. It wasn't dramatic, just a small confession about feeling a little lost in where I was headed. She didn't rush to fix it or dismiss it. She just listened. And in that silence, her eyes never wavered from mine. Her smile was subtle, not the kind that breaks wide, but the kind that lingers at the corners of her mouth, reassuring, steady. "You're figuring it out," she said softly, as though she knew I needed to hear it. And in that moment, her words carried more weight than I expected. At one point, she reached across the table to pass me a glass, and her fingers brushed mine. Just a second, maybe less, but it was enough. My chest tightened, my breath caught. She didn't pull back quickly. Instead, her fingertips lingered, featherlight before slipping away. If she noticed the way my pulse quickened, she didn't say. She only held my gaze a moment longer, and there was something unspoken in it, something careful but impossible to miss. The world around us blurred. Laughter from the other side of the room felt distant. The hum of music in the background turned into nothing more than a thread of sound. All that mattered was the closeness growing between us, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet way her stories melted into mine. She told me about her fears, not loudly, but in half sentences, like she wasn't used to giving them away. And I realized then that for all her confidence, there was a tenderness beneath it, a part of her that longed to be understood. And maybe that was why I couldn't look away. By the time I noticed how long we'd been talking, it didn't matter. The night wasn't slipping away anymore. It was ours. There's a moment in every night where the energy shifts, when the laughter dies down, when the noise thins out, and suddenly you realize how much time has slipped past. That's where we were. The others were still talking in the background, but their voices had faded into nothing more than a blur. It felt as though the room had folded in on itself until there was only her and me. I remember the silence that hung between us. It wasn't uncomfortable. Far from it. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, like the air itself was holding its breath. She sat across from me, leaning back slightly, her hand wrapped loosely around her glass. The lamp at her side cast a faint amber glow across her skin, softening her features, making her look almost timeless. It was then that I noticed the little things I had been ignoring all night. The curve of her lips when she was lost in thought. The way her lashes dipped lower when she smiled, as though she was guarding something unspoken. Even the way she breathed, slow, measured, seemed to draw me in, pulling me deeper into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. And that's when it hit me. I was drawn to her, not just to her voice or her presence or the warmth she carried so naturally, but to her. Entirely, completely. It wasn't a passing fascination or a fleeting spark. It was something heavier, something that pressed against my chest in a way that both thrilled and unnerved me. I tried to reason with myself. She was older, wiser, more grounded in life than I was. What would it mean to cross a line that society is so quick to judge? I could already hear the whispers, the sideways glances, the endless opinions. And yet, none of that mattered in the stillness of that moment. Because when I looked at her, I didn't see a number. I saw someone whose soul felt inexplicably aligned with mine. She shifted in her chair, her knee brushing lightly against mine beneath the table. The contact was subtle, accidental perhaps, but sent a current through me that I couldn't ignore. I froze, uncertain whether to move back or to stay exactly as I was. But then she didn't move either. She simply let the closeness linger, her eyes drifting back to mine with a quiet steadiness that made my heart stumble. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words tangled inside me. Instead, I let the silence stretch, try to read the unspoken language between us. Her gaze softened, not with pity or amusement, but with something I couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to invitation. And that was when I realized I wasn't imagining this. The pull between us was real. The only question was, what would I do about it? It's strange how the smallest movements can feel like the loudest moments. A hand resting, a breath lingering too close, a silence that doesn't quite let go. That's what the night had become. A collection of tiny gestures that carried more weight than words ever could. She leaned forward to tell me a story, her voice dropping lower, softer. The sound of it wrapped around me like a secret meant only for my ears. As she spoke, her hand slipped across the table, brushing against my forearm. It was so natural, so effortless, as though she hadn't even thought about it. But to me, it was everything. Her fingers rested lightly on my sleeve, just enough for me to feel the warmth of her touch seeping through the fabric. My heart lurched in my chest, not in panic, but in something closer to surrender. I should have pulled away, created space, reminded myself of all the reasons this shouldn't be happening. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement would break the fragile magic of the moment. She didn't withdraw either. Her hand lingered for a few breaths, her thumb tracing the edge of the seam absent-mindedly, as though testing what it felt like to bridge the space between us. The room had quieted by then, voices and laughter fading into the background. It was only her voice, her nearness, her touch. I looked at her, and she looked back, her eyes holding mine for longer than before. There was no smile this time, not the soft, playful one she'd given earlier. Instead, her expression was steady, almost searching, as though she was asking a question without speaking it aloud. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell her that yes, I felt it too. That the air between us had become charged, heavy with everything we weren't saying. But my throat was tight, and my words betrayed me. So I did the only thing I could. I let the silence speak for me. Her shoulder brushed mine when she leaned closer, her perfume faint but unmistakable. The contact was casual enough to pass unnoticed by anyone else, but to me, it was like standing too close to a fire. The warmth, the danger, the undeniable pull. And then she laughed, softly, almost nervously, as if to ease the tension she had created herself. But the sound didn't erase it. If anything, it deepened it, because beneath the laugh, I caught the faintest tremor in her breath, a hint that maybe she was just as aware of the closeness as I was. I could feel it then, the invisible line we had been circling all evening, that thin, delicate boundary between what was safe and what was something more. And in that moment, with her hand still resting on my arm, her knee brushing mine beneath the table, I knew we were no longer standing on opposite sides. We were crossing it, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. The night had slowed into something heavier, more deliberate. Every second stretched, thick with meaning, as though time itself had decided to linger with us. She hadn't moved her hand from my arm, and I hadn't given her reason to. The closeness that had once felt accidental now seemed intentional, like a silent agreement we were both too afraid to name. Her gaze drifted from my arm to my face, and when our eyes met, the world around us seemed to dissolve. I heard the muffled chatter in the background, the clinking of glasses, the faint hum of music, but all of it was blurred, distant, irrelevant. What I couldn't ignore was her. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't playfulness, though I'd seen her smile plenty that night. It wasn't simple kindness either, though that was part of who she was. No, this was something else. A depth, a weight, a vulnerability she had been carrying, waiting for the right moment to let it out. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but then she hesitated. Her fingers twitched slightly against my sleeve, and she looked down, her composure breaking for just a heartbeat. That tiny crack in her armor made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach for her, to reassure her, but something told me to wait, that whatever she was about to say needed to come freely, in her own rhythm. When she finally lifted her gaze again, her voice came out softer than I'd ever heard it. Low, careful, almost trembling. I've wanted this, she paused, swallowing the words like they were too heavy to release. Longer than you could ever imagine. The silence that followed felt endless. Her confession didn't crash into me like thunder. It seeped in like water, filling every corner of me until I could hardly breathe. My heart raced, not just from the shock of her words, but from the rawness behind them. There was no performance in her tone, no attempt at charm or seduction. It was stripped bare, honest. I could see it in her expression, the years of restraint, the quiet ache of someone who had wanted something but never allowed herself to reach for it. Her hand finally slipped away from my arm, as though she had given too much away, and she folded it into her lap, suddenly unsure of herself. That single gesture said as much as her words. She was afraid. Afraid of how I might react. Afraid she had crossed too far. And I sat there, stunned, my throat tight. Part of me wanted to speak immediately, to close the distance and erase her doubt. But another part of me, the part that was still reeling, needed to process the truth that had just landed between us. Her words hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament, delicate and beautiful, and I knew that whatever I did next had the power to either shatter it or make it shine. For a long moment, I didn't move. Her words still echoed in me, each one unraveling something I thought I had under control. I wanted this longer than you could ever imagine. She sat there, perfectly still, but I could see the tremor in her composure. Her shoulders were straighter than before, her chin lifted just enough to appear steady. Yet her eyes betrayed her, soft, uncertain, filled with a kind of fear she didn't often allow anyone to see. I knew that feeling. The risk of saying something that could change everything. The way silence after a confession feels heavier than the confession itself. And I couldn't let her sit in that silence alone. Slowly, I reached across the space between us. My hand hovered for a second, as though giving her the chance to pull back. But she didn't. So I let my fingers settle gently over hers, folding into the warmth of her palm. She looked down on her joined hands, startled at first, then back up at me. Her lips parted, as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, her breath caught, just audible enough for me to hear. I tightened my hold. Not too much, just enough to tell her that I wasn't running from this. That she wasn't alone in her wanting. "Do you think," I whispered, the words catching in my throat, "that you're the only one who's been holding something back?" Her expression shifted, her eyes widening just slightly. I could almost feel her heartbeat quicken through the delicate pulse at her wrist beneath my thumb. The truth spilled out of me then, not rehearsed, not careful, just real. I didn't know how to name it, or if I even should, but I feel it too. Every time you look at me, every time you laugh, every time I notice the little things about you I shouldn't be noticing. Her face softened, her guard slipping further, like a weight she had been carrying for too long was finally loosening. A faint smile ghosted her lips, though it trembled at the edges. "You mean that?" she asked quietly. There was no teasing in her voice now, no graceful confidence. Only hope. I nodded, brushing my thumb lightly against her knuckles, grounding myself in the warmth of her skin. "I mean it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, hands entwined, letting the silence stretch into something no longer heavy, but steady. I could feel the shift between us, from tension and doubt to something gentler, safer. She let out a long breath, one that seemed to carry years of restraint with it. Her shoulders relaxed, and slowly, she leaned closer, as though gravity itself was pulling her toward me. There was no rush, no desperation, only relief. And as her head tilted slightly, her hair brushing my arm, I realized this wasn't the beginning of something reckless. It was the beginning of something real. There are nights that fade quickly, forgotten by morning. And then there are nights like this one, nights that sink into you so deeply that you know, even as they unfold, that you'll carry them forever. She didn't let go of my hand. If anything, her grip grew steadier, her thumb brushing lightly against mine in a rhythm that felt almost instinctive. The smallest touch, yet it steadied me more than I could have imagined. We weren't speaking, not much anyway, but words felt unnecessary now. Everything we needed was already written in the closeness. In the quiet way she leaned just slightly toward me, in the calm that settled over us after hours of circling what we'd both been too afraid to admit. At some point, she shifted closer until the space between us was almost gone. I felt the warmth of her shoulder against mine, then the delicate weight of her head as it rested gently against me. It was such a simple thing, such a familiar gesture, and yet it unraveled me more than any confession could. Her cheek pressed lightly against my arm, her breathing slow, steady, syncing with the beat of my heart. I closed my eyes for a moment, memorizing it. The faint scent of her perfume, the softness of her hair brushing my jaw, the warmth of her presence seeping into me. For so long, I'd wondered what it would feel like to cross that invisible line between us. Now I knew. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't realized I'd been missing. She spoke then, her voice no louder than a whisper, vibrating softly against me. "Do you realize what this means?" I smiled faintly, my lips brushing the top of her hair as I answered. "It means we stop pretending. She let out a quiet laugh, not sharp or bright, but tender, the kind of laugh that comes when relief finally sinks in. Pretending, she repeated softly, as though the word itself was something fragile she was finally willing to set down. I turned slightly, just enough to look at her. Her eyes met mine, calm now, no longer hiding. And in that gaze I saw everything. The vulnerability, the longing, the unspoken years she had carried this with her. It struck me then that this wasn't just a new beginning for me. It was a release for her. We didn't make promises that night. We didn't rush into declarations or grand gestures. We didn't need to. What we shared was quieter, more powerful than that. It was the kind of understanding that doesn't require explanations. We sat there until the night grew deep and the sounds around us faded completely. When I finally rose to leave, she didn't let go immediately. Her hand lingered in mine, reluctant, as if she wasn't ready for the moment to end. And truthfully, neither was I. But as I stepped away, I carried with me the steady rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her head on my shoulder, and the weight of her words. Words that had changed everything. I wanted this longer than you could ever imagine. And now, so had I.